Good afternoon, and welcome back for the final day of the Alliance Conference. It is my pleasure to introduce our moderator for panel 4. Ambassador Gesa Bräutigam is the permanent representative of Germany to the OSCE. During the span of her diplomatic career, she has also served as, among others, political counselor at the German permanent delegation to NATO in Brussels, member of cabinet of the German foreign minister, minister counselor at the political department of the German embassy in Washington, D.C., and head of the EU coordination group at the German Federal Foreign Office. She holds a university degree in history and English from Eberhard Karls Universität in Tübingen, and she is a great champion for the topic of combating trafficking in human beings. Ambassador, so pleased to have you. The floor is yours.
Thank you, and thank you for your kind words of introduction. Exzellenzen, liebe Kolleginnen und Kollegen, meine Damen und Herren, es ist mir eine große Freude und Ehre, Sie zur 4. und letzten Arbeitssitzung der 22. Konferenz der Alliance Against Trafficking in Persons begrüßen zu dürfen, die dem Thema Upholding Victims' Rights and Strengthening Assistance gewidmet ist. Ich freue mich, so viele von Ihnen hier im Saal begrüßen zu können. Zusätzlich folgen uns und beteiligen sich eine ganze Reihe Kollegen online an diesem Abschlusspanel. Und ich freue mich sehr, dass der Sonderbeauftragte Voluntary mich gebeten hat, dieses Panel zu moderieren. Und ich habe diese Aufgabe sehr gerne übernommen. Wir haben bereits 3 exzellente Expertenpanels und vielfältige Side-Events zu den Einzelthemen miterlebt und diskutiert. Vom Aufbau effektiven Opferschutzsysteme über Wege für alle Menschenhandelsopfer unkonditionierten Schutz zu gewährleisten, insbesondere eben für die Schwächsten in der Gesellschaft, die Kinder, bis zu unserem heutigen Panel. In dem geht es um den Ausblick auf inklusiven und umfassenden Opferschutz. Wir alle sehen in diesen Wochen Leidfall auf die Lage in der Ukraine, auf den Krieg, den die Russische Föderation gegen ihr Nachbarland, die Ukraine, führt, und auf die inzwischen 4,2 Millionen Kriegsflüchtlinge in den Nachbarländern. Und zu diesen kommen noch eine weitaus größere Zahl von Vertriebenen im eigenen Land, in der Ukraine, hinzu. Und es sind besonders die vulnerabelsten unter ihnen, denn die Hälfte der Flüchtlinge sind Kinder, die über das Kriegsleid hinaus Menschenhandel und Ausbeutung ausgeliefert sein können. Und trotz des ansteigenden Problems, und das ist global, des ansteigenden Problems des Menschenhandels, zeigt diese Konferenz aber auch, dass es sehr gute und verfolgenswerte Ansätze gibt, Menschenhandel erfolgreich zu bekämpfen und die Schwächsten zu schützen. Und diesbezügliche Anstrengungen müssen auf allen Ebenen verstärkt werden. Ich freue mich sehr, dass ich zu unserem heutigen Panel 5 Expertinnen und Experten begrüßen darf. Und sie werden aus unterschiedlichen Blickwinkeln inklusive und umfassende Schutzkonzepte vorstellen und diskutieren. Das ist einmal aus parlamentarischer Sicht, aus der Sicht einer nationalen Koordinatorin, aus der Sicht des Hohen Flüchtlingskommissars, aus der Sicht eines NGO-Netzwerks und des ODIHR-Rats von Überlebenden des Menschenhandels. Und sie werden dies auch mit Bezug auf die Lage der Flüchtlinge in der Ukraine und aus der Ukraine tun. Ich möchte noch kurz, bevor wir mit dem Panel starten, darauf hinweisen, dass die Panelisten jeweils bis zu 10 Minuten Zeit haben für ihren Vortrag, denn wir wollen die Zeit, die wir insgesamt haben, die 1,5 Stunden, für eine interaktive Diskussion nutzen. Und ich freue mich nun, Ihnen unseren ersten Redner vorstellen zu dürfen. Es handelt sich um den US-Kongressabgeordneten Christoph Smith, der zugleich Sonderbeauftragter für Fragen des Menschenhandels der Parlamentarischen Versammlung der OSZE ist. Christoph Smith ist ein hochrangiges Mitglied des Ausschusses für Auswärtige Angelegenheiten des Repräsentantenhauses. Er ist Co-Vorsitzender der Tom Lantos Menschenrechtskommission und ranghohes Mitglied der parteiübergreifenden Congressional Executive Commission on China. Aber vor allen Dingen ist Congressman Smith der Autor von 5 Gesetzen gegen Menschenhandel in den Vereinigten Staaten. Darunter ist das bahnbrechende Gesetz zum Schutz von Opfern von Menschenhandel aus dem Jahr 2000 und nachfolgende Gesetze zur Bekämpfung des Menschenhandels aus den Jahren 2003 und 2006. Und er ist ebenfalls der Autor des Frederick Douglass Trafficking Victims Prevention and Protection Acts aus dem Jahr 2019 und des International Magens Law aus dem Jahr 2016. Ich freue mich sehr, es ist mir eine große Ehre, Ihnen jetzt das Wort erteilen zu dürfen. Congressman Smith, the screen is yours, please.
Madam Ambassador, thank you for your leadership. Thank you for your very kind words, and thank you for caring so much about those who are victimized by trafficking. And Val Ritchie, great work that you're doing on behalf of the OSCE as a special representative. So wonderful work. And thanks for inviting me to be part of this panel. You know, I know many have raised during this conference Putin's barbaric invasion of Ukraine, displacing, as you just pointed out, according to UN estimates, 4.2 million people to neighboring countries, primarily to Poland, and really a great work by Poland to welcome and to have that welcome mat out for so many people who have been sent into the refugee status that they are in now. And of course, as you also pointed out, millions more who are internally displaced, IDPs. Most Ukrainian refugees, as we all know, are women and children. Ukrainian men are obligated to stay and fight inside of Ukraine. Women and children, including tens of thousands of orphans and unaccompanied minors, flee for their lives to a new country and are often without food, shelter, and safety. An engraved invitation from nefarious networks of human trafficking predators. Victims of Putin's barbaric war, they now face a second victimization and absolutely need our protection. We witnessed one of the largest scale of human displacements in contemporary European history. We urge the United States government, and I've been doing that, and others inside the Congress and allies as well, to invest in the highest security standards to make sure women and children are not victim to abuse, exploitation, or violence. We are already hearing reports of traffickers deceiving Ukrainian women and children with bogus offers of rides to safe passage and employment. I think Tatiana said it well in the New York Post article just a few days ago. Quote, "We may be sending them from one hell to another." The humanitarian crisis is indeed exploding both inside the country and for those seeking refuge. Yet despite facing an existential threat, the free world continues to be astonished and inspired by the Ukrainian people's enormous strength, courage, resiliency, and desire to fight tyranny. We must do all we can to prevent their suffering at the hands of human traffickers. We must use this platform at the OSCE as an opportunity to coordinate our efforts to better protect these vulnerable people. We must ensure that both public and private sector humanitarian workers are situationally aware of the risks for trafficking, to know the telltale signs, and then take all means necessary to prevent it. One key resource is our trafficking survivors leaders. Survivor voices are what inspired me, frankly, beginning back in 1995 to begin writing and then successfully writing the first and historic anti-trafficking law in the United States, the Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2000. And survivor feedback is what continues to prove all of our laws across the OSCE space and really around the world to write better laws that really meet the needs and also combats this in the most strategic way. Through the OSCE ODIHR International Survivors of Trafficking Advisory Council, we have this key resource to address trafficking during times of peace and during humanitarian crises. Let's not forget the importance of listening to these survivor experts, especially during difficult times like today. I look forward to hearing from our fellow panelist and member of ISTAC, Mr. Piraino-Guzman. I'm sure what he has to say will, again, not only inspire, but enlighten us as to the path forward. Another resource that I believe could be extremely useful to address this situation is the new OSCE Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights Handbook on National Referral Mechanisms. Pardon me. It shares government policies and introduces critical concepts that recognizes the importance of age-appropriate and trauma-informed approaches, which are critical during these times. It also recognizes the key role survivors play in informing policy. Finally, I'd like to return to that earlier conversation about the importance of preventing human trafficking in our supply chains. In 2015, the United States, the greatest consumer of goods in the world, and I'm talking about our government, expanded our 2003 Federal Acquisition Regulation Ending Trafficking in Persons Rule, which came out of the law that I wrote in 2003, which applies to U.S. federal contracts and subcontracts. A provision banning the use of human trafficking and forced labor in supply chains places several requirements on companies providing goods or services to any federal government department. It also prohibits federal government employees, and contractors and subcontractors from engaging in trafficking in persons, including purchasing commercial sex, and from engaging in certain activities known to lead to human trafficking, such as charging workers recruitment fees, destroying, concealing, or confiscating workers' identity documents, or using misleading and fraudulent recruitment practices. In 2019, I authored the Frederick Douglass Trafficking Prevention and Protection Act, which directed various U.S. government agencies, including the State Department, Department of Labor, U.S. Agency for International Development, OMB, and others, to annually report on investigations into contractors that may have violated anti-trafficking laws and regulations. You got to do oversight in an aggressive way to ensure compliance with the law, and that was what was behind that. I do want to applaud the OSCE leadership on this issue. In 2017, the Ministerial Council tasked the Secretary General to, quote, ensure that no activities of the OSCE executive structures, including the issuing of contracts for goods and services, contribute to any form of trafficking in human beings. I commend the Office of the OSCE Special Representative and Coordinator, again, for combating trafficking in human beings, for its leadership on this issue. And thank you, Val, again, for your tremendous work, as well as OSCE Secretary General Helga Schmid for following through on this very, very important commitment. I look forward to questions and to this discussion. And again, I thank you for this privilege of joining you today.
Congressman Smith, vielen Dank für Ihre Ausführungen und insbesondere auch für den Hinweis, dass es gerade die Überlebenden sind, des Menschenhandels, die wertvolle Hinweise an die Gesetzgeber geben können, um Gesetze und den Schutz von gegen Menschenhandel noch besser und stärker zu machen. Als nächste Sprecherin habe ich die Ehre zu begrüßen Magdalena Nestorovska, Staatssekretärin im Innenministerium der Republik Nordmazedonien. Sie ist ebenfalls Koordinatorin der Nationalen Kommission zur Bekämpfung des Menschenhandels und der illegalen Migration. Davor war sie Staatsrätin für Humanressourcen im Verteidigungsministerium und als Abteilungsleiterin im Dienst für allgemeine und gemeinsame Angelegenheiten tätig. Frau Nestorovska, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, allow me to greet you on behalf of the Ministry of Interior of the Republic of North Macedonia and on my own behalf as a national coordinator and the State Secretary too, to express my exceptional honor to be part of this 22nd conference of the Alliance Against Trafficking in Person, dedicated to strengthening of our efforts for victim protection. To be honest, one of the basic lessons I learned when I started working in this field was that the THB victims are not some invisible and nameless persons somewhere far away from us. It was difficult for me to realize that they are not invisible, but we are not able to see them. Now it's completely clear for me that our moral and legal responsibility is bigger than their invisibility. This obligation is a personal to each and every one of us as individuals. Even more, it is a collective obligation and task of each country. The Republic of North Macedonia is dominant country of transit of THB because one of the main channels for smuggling of migrants passes through my country. North Macedonia is a country of final destination as well, where the victims and potential victims, mostly young women from neighboring countries, are exploited for sexual and labor purposes in catering facilities that are located in the western part of the country. Sometimes the THB gains domestic characteristics, and the citizens of our country become victims of sexual exploitation and forced child marriages in their own country. For example, last year in Republic of North Macedonia, 48 THB victims were identified, of which 6 were children, mostly foreigners 40, and 8 domestic victims. So I have to stress that most dominant types of exploitation in the Republic of North Macedonia definitely is the sexual and labor exploitation. Forced marriages within minors are also on the rise, but to be honest, the increasing of the number of child THB victims is of our particular concern. In the Republic of North Macedonia, THB is based on a simple philosophy. Firstly, to detect everyone who can be and should be part of the mission called the fight against trafficking in human beings. And secondly, to include all of them as relevant partners for achieving the common goal. So in 2001, government established a body, National Commission, which is the mosaic of state bodies, the non-governmental sector, and the international organization. Each and every of these institutions are an important link in the chain of cover different areas in the fight against trafficking in human beings. In simple words, its mission is to create the strategy of the country that will guarantee an effective fight against trafficking in human beings. The National Commission during this period of more than 20 years adopt 5 strategies and 5 action plans, constantly changing the rules of game to provide an adequate response to the new challenges in THB. So the National Commission for more than 2 decades created the common framework for joint action of all partners within starting with adopting the policy and strategy through building the normative framework and finishing with the operational action in practice of various institutions in the country. The main and most difficult task during these years for the National Commission was to raise social awareness for all stakeholders, such as teachers, journalists, policy, doctors, and judges, to convince them that each and every one of them have their own role in this fight. Let's look several very obvious results of effective partnership initiated by the National Commission of the Republic of North Macedonia during the last years. First, between the MOE and public prosecution, the result is the establishment of the National Unit for Combating Migrant Smuggling and Human Trafficking Task Force in 2018. 2, between the MOE and Ministry of Labor and Social Policy, the result is the formation of 5 mobile teams for identification of vulnerable categories of persons, including the THB victims in different municipalities across the country where there are significant risk of trafficking in human beings. 3, between the MOE and the Office of the Ombudsman, the result is the new Office of the National Reporter within the Office of the Ombudsman, which is evaluated by the relevant stakeholders with the highest marks. 4, between the Ministry of Labor and Social Policy and the NGO sector, the result is a specialized center of THB victims, which is under the competence of the Ministry of Labor and Social Policy and is managed in partnership with citizen associations. 5, between National Commission and the local self-government. The result is formation of 5 local commissions in the local self-government council, where all bodies and organizations represented at a local level in the fight THB and protection of victims. National Commission also gave recommendation on joint cooperation between neighboring countries and beyond in order to exchange experience and use the lesson learned from foreign actors in countries in the region. Therefore, in the past year, the National Commission initiated and signed agreements on cooperation with national commissions in this area with Bulgaria, Montenegro, Kosovo, Serbia, and Slovenia, and negotiations have begun with Greece. I will tell you in confidence that we stole a model of a task force from National Commission from Serbia, model of the local commissions from Bulgaria, model for compensation of damages to victims from a law of Kosovo. So we still try to discover some good idea, some effective practices from the National Commission of the region or wider. To be honest, now we are on process of stalling the one very good idea from Bosnia. I think my colleague, the coordinator from National Commission from Bosnia is here. Maybe he will try to explain the new project. What are the other strategic directions through which the National Commission creates a new partnership and implements the will, not only of the country, but of the whole society to fight trafficking in human beings? Firstly, the national legislation must be harmonized with the EU standard. So in 2018, the Republic of North Macedonia incorporated the principle of non-punishment of victims of trafficking in human beings in criminal code. During the last year, the Commission, in cooperation with the competential institutions, drafted the law on payment of a monetary compensation to victims of criminal offenses. The law is in procedure in Parliament, and we hope that very fast will be adopted. Secondly, to obtain the minimum action that our country can do is to establish a legal mechanism and provide to victims access to appropriate and effective remedies, such as a compensation regardless of their immigration status, information, legal advice, and service available in the language they can understand. Third, in the next period, we are focused on creating a functional operational team for coordination and management of the cases of trafficking in human beings and formal identification of the victims. Four, and last but not least, one of the next steps will be to create a new partnership and new form of cooperation with business community to prevent the increasing of labor exploitation as a risk of THB. Ladies and gentlemen, we are witnessing quick negative phenomenon through which the world is passing. I would like to mention the pandemic caused by COVID-19, the easy availability, but also the vulnerability of children on the internet, and now the war in Ukraine, which has, as expected, caused a new wave of refugees. Criminals adapt very quickly to the new circumstances, taking advantage of the people's vulnerabilities. That means that each and every one of us, every country, must be fully prepared for the new attempts. The excuse like we are far away from Ukraine is not real anymore. For example, North Macedonia is not a country of interest to the refugees, at last at the moment, but you never know how migrant flows will change. We have not forgotten what happened at our border when during the migrant crisis 2015 and 2016, a human tsunami of 1 million people passed through my country, taking consideration that we have 1,800,000 citizens. Also, no one expected such tectonic security disruption in 21st century caused by Russian military aggression on Ukraine, and millions of displaced people who could become easy prey for the traffickers. In this situation, we can best understand the need for interinstitutional cooperation and cooperation between institutional with international organizations as citizen association in the country and more broadly between the countries themselves. In the future, as a national commission, we will continue in this direction. I am personally convinced that the concept of inclusiveness and completeness sends two messages. Firstly, everyone must find their place in the system of fight against trafficking in human beings and play their own role in the best possible way. And secondly, there should not be any part of this fight uncovered by an appropriate response and appropriate measure in order to help and protection the victim. Thank you for your attention.
Vielen Dank, Frau Staatssekretärin, dass Sie die Erfahrungen Ihres Landes Nordmazedonien geteilt haben mit uns hier und auf die effektiven Partnerships eingegangen sind und die Best Examples, die man auch in Nachbarländern und in anderen, von anderen Teilnehmerstaaten dieser Organisation finden kann. Als nächsten Panelisten möchte ich gerne Christoph Bierwirth vorstellen, UNHCR. Er ist seit 2018 der Leiter des Verbindungsbüros von UNHCR zur OSCE und den in Wien ansässigen VN-Organisationen. In dieser Funktion fungiert er auch als einer der Co-Moderatoren der Arbeitsgruppe 2 der Geneva International Discussions. Zuvor war Herr Bierwirth als UNHCR-Vertreter in Armenien tätig und arbeitete für die Organisation in Georgien und am Hauptsitz von UNHCR in Genf. Herr Bierwirth, Sie haben das Wort, bitte.
Thank you very much, Madam Moderator. Excellencies, delegates, colleagues and friends. I'm very grateful that UNHCR is given the opportunity to also contribute to this concluding panel of the Alliance event and to share with you some thoughts and considerations on ways forward. I have the privilege to be able to build on the contribution which was made by our Deputy High Commissioner in the opening session on Monday. She reminded us on the complex linkages between development, poverty, conflicts and displacement, and on the many acute ongoing conflicts which challenge peace in our today's world. Let me recall also a quote attributed to the Secretary General, who said, "For human traffickers, war is not a tragedy, it's an opportunity, and women and children are the targets." Building on these observations, please allow me to do two things in my little contribution. First, to share some thoughts on the principles which should guide, from UNHCR perspective, our common efforts to prevent refugees and other of concern falling victims to trafficking, and to enhance the protection of those at risk or of those who have already become victims. Second, I would like to share with you some very specific observations in the Ukrainian situation context, and in that context, make some suggestions on measures and approaches to be taken. While focusing on the Ukraine context, this is done in the understanding that all the many other conflicts in the world should not be forgotten. On principles, our efforts should be rights-based, thus respect the inherent dignity of victims and persons at risk of falling victim of trafficking, and should respect the principle of non-discrimination. Efforts should be victim-focused, encourage and build on victim participation, respecting the individual self-determination, and in case of cases concerning children, the best interest principle should govern all the efforts. Cooperation among different governmental, international, and civil society actors should be based on the understanding that only comprehensive, well-adjusted, multi-actor and multidimensional efforts based on mutual respect for the different mandates and areas of expertise can lead to effective results, both as to prevention and to response. In the case of any newly developing crisis, such as we face now in context of Ukraine, anti-trafficking actions need to be mainstreamed into the humanitarian response efforts from the very outset of designing and implementing humanitarian operations. And resources must be adjusted according to the dimensions of the challenges faced. While in the context of the present Ukraine crisis, the international community, including OSCE and UNHCR, can build on anti-trafficking mechanisms which have been built up and developed during recent years, both regionally and in country context, including by the establishment of comprehensive capacity building and establishment of referral mechanisms. These last 2 days showed that there are remaining shortcomings and challenges still to be addressed. Let me now turn to the particularities of the Ukrainian situation, which is slightly different to similar situations we faced before and require a certain adjustment of our response efforts. I want to raise 3 points. First, dimension of the crisis and the profile of displaced populations. With a total, Ms. Bräutigam mentioned the figure, and I must say, whenever we mention a figure, 10 minutes later, it's already outdated. So I refer to over 10 million people displaced, more than 4 million having crossed the Ukrainian border, becoming refugees, and more than 6 million being IDPs. And also considering that 90% of the displaced are women and children, the sheer size of this displacement challenge exceeds all the available response capacities. So we can build on something, but this is definitely not big enough, effective enough to address a crisis we face now. Considering the profile of the displaced, we also see that at the same time, we have a displacement crisis, but also a family separation crisis. And these two challenges, these two types of crisis should be addressed in a consolidated way. Some thoughts on how to address this. The dimension of the challenge requires engagement of many actors, acknowledging different capacities, presences, experiences, and established partnerships on the ground. There is definitely a need to work together and to make use of all available resources and to make use of synergies. While from UN doctrine, I can't hide this, efforts within Ukraine are managed under the so-called cluster approach, which are led by our ODIHR colleagues. And on the other hand, the regional refugee response is managed by UNHCR, pursuing the so-called sector approach. At country level, there's a lot of flexibility. So even if you have these overall coordination roles, if you have a country operation, you look at who has the best and the biggest resources on the ground and how we can jointly beef them up. Joint efforts aimed at enhancing the response capacities within authorities and NGOs are encouraged. Such efforts could build on existing OSCE engagement and cooperation with partners, including IOM, UNHCR, civil society, and can also build on the already ongoing UNICEF, UNHCR Blue Dot initiative, which provides a one-window service point. UNHCR has already significantly enhanced our presence in the countries bordering Ukraine. We had very minimum offices before. In particular, we did deployment of emergency teams and are now in the process of regularizing in longer term our offices in these affected areas. My office here in Vienna will be very happy to facilitate contacts for joint training activities. Val, I think we did so much in the past, and maybe we can discuss a OSCE UNHCR on tour idea to reach out into the affected regions and enhance targeted traveling. The second particularity I want to raise is consequences of travel privileges and freedom of movement. The visa-free regime applied to Ukrainian citizens holding biometric passports has largely avoided any issues related to access to territory and protection, as has the activation of the EU Temporary Protection Directive. So people have no problem entering into safety. However, the visa-free regime has complicated early registration and understanding of secondary movements. Presently, many of the displaced are still trying to stay very close to Ukraine, awaiting what will happen. It's not unlikely that this may change should the conflict become protracted. And the consequence for our work, in the past, we focused on training and cooperating with asylum authorities, which normally were the first point of contact for people fleeing. This is not the case in this present particular situation. Also, the temporary protection status can help in making people addressing the authorities. So we have to look at common efforts to map where are actually the points where displaced population address authorities or other competent partners who can then engage in the identification of victims of trafficking or of people who are at risk of trafficking. We have to expand the audience for our training, and we have to probably expand the network into different segments of government authorities. One more observation in that field. While the welcoming approach vis-à-vis refugees from Ukraine in first and second line countries, both by authorities and civil society, is very much appreciated, and it really needs to be commended as much as possible. And it has enhanced understanding and respect for the very institution of asylum. This led to decentralized accommodation and support options which bear risks of their own. It's easier to manage certain things if you have a reception facility, and we have to adjust this. So in that context, we should look at options to establish a form of a vetting mechanism, e.g. for housing offered through online booking platforms, and offer quick response options for persons who are accommodated, decentralized, and face challenges so that they can approach someone and if need be, relocated elsewhere. The third and last observation I would like to share, there is a need for enhanced systematic regional information exchange and cooperation. The mobility I flagged already, that people may go for secondary or tertiary movement, they may need time to find relatives somewhere else and then find out, shall we go there or not? Are we welcome? This will mean that displaced people will stay on the move, will stay moving. And we have to take precautions to make sure that persons, in particular those potentially at risk, would not disappear from our radar. So in addition to the local efforts to respond to the risk of trafficking, there needs a bit more of transborder networking. And I think here in the room and in the last days, we had La Strada and other NGOs which work not only country specific, but have networks. And I think this is really the moment where this networking element of these NGOs could be enhanced and play a very important role. UNHCR is establishing now a task force, and that task force will be open to all UN regional partners, civil societies, organizations who operate practically on the ground. Information will come out, I would expect next week, using the available networks. And then in addition to this more practical cooperation where we try to offer good offices, secretariat function kind of, without overly coordinating. That's maybe not our role. We need also to make use of other existing networks like ICAT for those who are not so operational but can play a very important role in awareness raising and in joining advocacy initiative. I hope these initial thoughts are of help and will trigger some further debate. Thank you very much.
Ganz herzlichen Dank, Herr Bierwirth, für Ihre Ausführungen und insbesondere für Ihre Ausführungen zu den Besonderheiten der derzeitigen Situation und der Auswirkungen des Krieges in der Ukraine, die wir sehen und mit denen wir umgehen müssen. Unsere vierte Panelistin ist Geneviève Kollers. Sie ist Gründerin und Koordinatorin eines Kollektivs von 28 Verbänden mit dem Namen Gemeinsam gegen Menschenhandel für das katholische Hilfswerk Frankreichs. Und sie ist auch Mitglied des Koordinierungsausschusses des MIPROF, einer interministeriellen Mission zur Bekämpfung von Gewalt gegen Frauen und Menschenhandel. Frau Kollers ist ebenso Mitglied der Nationalen Menschenrechtskommission und dient als nationale Berichterstatterin für internationale Gremien zur Bekämpfung des Menschenhandels in Frankreich. Und last but not least, Mitglied der EU-Plattform der Zivilgesellschaft zur Bekämpfung des Menschenhandels. Und sie trägt damit regelmäßig zur Arbeit der Europäischen Union, des Europarats, von Greta, der OSCE und der UNO bei und sie leitete Feldmissionen in verschiedenen Ländern. Und Herr Bierwirth hat gerade von den Netzwerken gesprochen. Frau Kollers ist sicherlich genau die richtige Person, um jetzt diesen Gedanken auch aufzunehmen. Bitte, Sie haben das Wort.
Grand merci de votre invitation à cette rencontre dont nous repartirons avec beaucoup de motivation pour continuer à collaborer à l'échelle internationale et entre société civile et institutions. Société civile que je représente aujourd'hui. Les personnes susceptibles d'être victimes de la traite des êtres humains ont des profils variés. Des millions d'entre elles sont aujourd'hui à la recherche de refuge suite à la guerre en Ukraine. Il est aujourd'hui nécessaire de se préoccuper de toutes les personnes exposées à l'exploitation, la traite et à tous les enfants qui risquent de disparaître aujourd'hui. Ce qui se met en place dans le cadre de la crise ukrainienne doit permettre d'améliorer la prévention et la lutte contre la traite de façon durable, en s'intéressant à toutes les victimes de toutes les formes d'exploitation. Exploitation sexuelle, mariage forcé, travail forcé, esclavage domestique, obligation à mendier, contrainte à commettre de délits, etc. Que ce soit en direct ou par Internet, et une approche par les droits centrée sur les victimes est impérative. L'Union européenne, et en particulier la France, qui en assure aujourd'hui la présidence tournante, doivent respecter et faire respecter le droit international en garantissant que les Ukrainiens et Ukrainiennes, ainsi que les étrangers de nombreux pays qui y étudient, qui sont réfugiés, obtiennent une protection dans les pays de l'Union européenne, et cette protection doit se faire sans écarter les autres personnes demandeuses d'asile et réfugiées présentes dans nos pays et qui ne sont pas des ressortissants ukrainiens. À ce jour, en France, il n'existe pas de ligne téléphonique nationale dédiée à la traite des êtres humains, disponible 7 jours sur 7 et 24 heures sur 24. Il faut donner plus de moyens aux dispositifs existants ou en créer des complémentaires pour favoriser l'identification des victimes et permettre une meilleure orientation vers les structures spécialisées sur tout le territoire. L'hébergement citoyen est plébiscité par les autorités pour faire face à l'afflux des migrants. Des plateformes sur Internet sont notamment mises en place pour favoriser la mise en relation entre les particuliers et les personnes en quête d'hébergement. Ces mises en relation peuvent mettre en difficulté à la fois les familles accueillantes qui se retrouvent à accompagner des personnes qu'elles hébergent dans leur démarche administrative, trop souvent sans l'aide de professionnels, mais aussi les personnes hébergées qui peuvent être victimes de citoyens mal intentionnés et soumis à la traite des êtres humains. Nous sollicitons davantage de moyens pour les associations qui favorisent un encadrement des foyers accueillants afin d'exercer un accompagnement professionnel et une sécurité accrue. Face à la situation de crise, des réponses immédiates sont nécessaires. Internet et les réseaux sociaux sont de précieux espaces d'information, d'échange, d'entraide. Ce sont également des espaces à fort risque de fausses informations et de recrutement par des personnes mal intentionnées, profitant de la crise et de la détresse des adultes et des enfants. Nous rappelons la nécessité d'informer les personnes à risque des dangers existants sur Internet et les réseaux sociaux. Nous rappelons la responsabilité des sites et plateformes de contrôler et signaler les contenus proposés mettant en danger ou impliquant les enfants. L'hébergement hôtelier peut s'avérer être un lieu à risque pour les personnes réfugiées. Différents points de vigilance existent. La présence de proxénètes aux abords des hôtels, des demandes de participation aux tâches ménagères de la part des hôteliers, des faits d'exploitation sexuelle suspectés par le personnel hôtelier mais non signalés. Nous appelons à la sensibilisation du personnel hôtelier aux problématiques de traite des êtres humains, ainsi qu'à un renforcement du suivi des conditions d'accueil des réfugiés dans leur établissement. La santé des personnes réfugiées est une préoccupation majeure, tant au niveau physique, compte tenu des violences, conditions de départ et de voyage, qu'au niveau psychologique. Nous savons que les fragilités psychologiques, l'exposition à un environnement à forte charge traumatique vient altérer les capacités des personnes. Il est important que le soutien psychologique par des professionnels formés soit systématiquement proposé au même titre que les besoins primaires, hébergement, alimentation et soins médicaux. D'après les chiffres du gouvernement français, 36 000 Ukrainiens sont arrivés en France au 2 avril. Cette augmentation rapide a conduit à la mise en place de plusieurs points d'accueil dans les institutions et les associations. C'est le cas à la gare de l'Est ou du Nord à Paris, à l'aéroport de Beauvais, par exemple. Ils permettent aux réfugiés une prise en charge administrative, humaine, médicale, ainsi que des aides pour orienter vers des structures d'hébergement. Mais ces lieux sont également des lieux de prédilection de personnes mal intentionnées, voire de réseaux d'exploitation qui abusent des réfugiés. Ainsi, nous sollicitons un soutien financier pour mener des actions de sensibilisation à la lutte contre la traite des êtres humains auprès des aidants de ces points d'accueil. Il est nécessaire que les bénévoles et les professionnels directement en contact avec les migrants lors de leur arrivée en France aient des outils pour les avertir sur les risques liés à l'exploitation. En parallèle, il est important que les personnes qui assurent un suivi dans la durée puissent, à partir d'indicateurs, repérer les victimes potentielles et les orienter vers des associations spécialisées. Les autorités et les institutions et associations engagées dans l'accueil des réfugiés doivent donner une réponse coordonnée, fluide, sécurisée dans la mise à l'abri des personnes. La pénurie actuelle de candidats sur des emplois de femmes de ménage ou d'aide à la personne dans la restauration, dans le nettoyage des entreprises, le textile, l'agriculture, laisse à craindre que certains profitent de la vulnérabilité des personnes qui fuient la guerre et qui recherchent un travail. Il est important de sensibiliser et d'informer les personnes exilées quant à leurs droits au travail, à la santé, à l'hébergement. Une meilleure connaissance du système français et de son fonctionnement permet d'éviter les risques d'exploitation. Faire savoir qu'il est illégal de contraindre une personne à vendre des actes sexuels, faire connaître les numéros d'appel de violences sexuelles ou sexistes ou autres numéros d'urgence et donner la possibilité financière à ces numéros d'appel de recourir à des traducteurs, traductrices en langue ukrainienne et russe est nécessaire. La majorité des foyers qui fuient actuellement le conflit sont des femmes et des enfants. Leur protection doit être une réelle préoccupation. Bien qu'il faille saluer les nombreux élans de solidarité et de générosité, monter dans la voiture d'un inconnu ou rester dans une maison avec un inconnu crée des risques, en particulier pour les femmes et les jeunes filles voyageant seules, ne parlant pas la langue du pays. Il y a besoin urgent de protection solide et de services coordonnés pour accompagner les réfugiés ukrainiens comme tous les réfugiés, et notamment les femmes. Il convient d'ajouter que les réseaux d'exploitation sexuelle d'Europe de l'Est installés en France sont très actifs et organisés. L'exploitation sexuelle des mineurs a augmenté drastiquement depuis quelques années en France. Nous constatons notamment que l'aide sociale à l'enfance ne dispose pas d'assez de moyens pour assurer la protection des enfants et prévenir les recrutements qui peuvent être faits dans les structures d'accueil et d'hébergement. La lutte contre l'exploitation sexuelle des mineurs doit être considérée comme un réel point de vigilance, d'autant plus que l'escorting et le phénomène de prostitution indoor compliquent le repérage et l'orientation des victimes. Il est de ce fait important d'informer les mineurs que les contraindre à des actes sexuels tarifés est interdit par la législation française. Important aussi de leur faire savoir qu'il existe des centres de planification et d'éducation familiale gratuits. Pour finir, l'Ukraine autorise la gestation pour autrui. Pendant la crise sanitaire du Covid-19, beaucoup de bébés sont restés bloqués dans le pays et même après l'assouplissement des restrictions, des dizaines de bébés n'ont pas été récupérés par les parents d'intention. Un sort similaire pourrait toucher des bébés nés pendant ce mois-ci ou qui vont naître dans les mois à venir. Les femmes en situation de détresse pourraient décider de devenir mères porteuses avec le risque de devoir quitter le pays d'un moment à l'autre en se réfugiant dans un pays tiers et en devenant des proies d'autres formes d'exploitation si elles n'ont aucune ressource économique sur laquelle pouvoir compter. La loi ukrainienne prévoit que l'acte de naissance des enfants nés de mères porteuses indique les parents d'intention comme parents. Aussi, il existe un fort risque que les enfants nés dans ces conditions soient privés du droit fondamental de chaque enfant à avoir une identité. Cette situation dramatique vient mettre en lumière les aspects préoccupants du cadre réglementaire de la gestation pour autrui dans certains pays, de la problématique dans une perspective transnationale au regard de la protection des enfants et des risques de traite. La population et les couples en particulier devraient être informés des réalités du recours aux mères porteuses, à la gestation pour autrui et des risques existants. Placement dans un orphelinat si les parents d'intention ou les clients des agences de GPA changent de projet. Pour les enfants placés en orphelinat, risque conséquent de négligence, de vente avec fort risque d'exploitation. Par exemple, exploitation sexuelle, domestique, prélèvement d'organes. Pour les mères porteuses, si les parents d'intention décident qu'ils ne veulent plus l'enfant, être obligés d'avorter et, si elles ne le font pas, devoir rendre les paiements. Ne pas pouvoir fuir d'un pays dangereux avant d'accoucher. Selon les législations en vigueur, les enfants nés de GPA sont extrêmement vulnérables et non protégés dès leur naissance. La dimension financière de la gestation pour autrui et les pratiques commerciales des agences spécialisées devraient être davantage contrôlées et connues des couples s'engageant dans cette démarche. Les femmes ukrainiennes réfugiées en France doivent être informées de l'interdit de la GPA pour éviter qu'elles ne reçoivent des sollicitations à cette fin. Désolée, j'ai peut-être été un peu longue, mais merci beaucoup de votre écoute.
Vielen Dank, Frau Kolas, für Ihre sehr umfangreichen Aspekte, die Sie beleuchtet haben und die noch einmal deutlicher gemacht haben, dass die Gefahren, die drohen, in so vielen Bereichen existieren und wir sehr aufmerksam sein müssen und sehr gezielt unsere Informationspolitik betrachten müssen, um dem entgegenzuwirken. Ich freue mich jetzt, den letzten Sprecher unseres Panels begrüßen zu dürfen, Herrn Piraino-Guzman. Er ist lizenzierter Verhaltenspsychologe, Fürsprecher, Fallmanager und er ist selbst Überlebender des Kindersexhandels. Von Präsident Barack Obama wurde er in den Beirat der Vereinigten Staaten für Menschenhandel berufen. Im Jahr 2020 wurde er außerdem vom Generalstaatsanwalt der Vereinten Nationen zum Mitglied des Freiwilligenfonds der Vereinten Nationen für Opfer von Sklaverei und Menschenhandel sowie zum Sonderberichterstatter für die Arbeit und sexuelle Ausbeutung von Kindern und insbesondere von Jungen ernannt. Herr Piraino-Guzman, Sie haben das Wort, bitte.
Madam Ambassador, thank you very much for the introduction. Good afternoon. I am a licensed behavioral psychologist and I specialize in trauma-informed care to survivors of contemporary forms of slavery and human trafficking. I am also a survivor of child sexual exploitation and human trafficking. I am also a member of the United Nations Contemporary Fund for Victims of Contemporary Forms of Slavery and Human Trafficking. And I have the honor of sitting at the International Survivor of Trafficking Advisory Council, a tool that is at your disposal there is compiled of survivors of trafficking from all over the world with unique expertise and experiences who are able and willing to provide feedback, recommendations, and their own personal experience and expertise to help move our anti-trafficking movement forward. I grew up with trauma and was shaped by trauma. At the age of 9, my father left, leaving my mom in a wheelchair and leaving me with an eye half cut open. At the age of 12, I experienced my first sexual assault while selling articles door by door. At the age of 10, in August 10, 1999, I knocked on the wrong door. At the age of 14, I was taken from my home country in Honduras and brought to San Diego, California, where for 6 months I experienced human trafficking and experienced over 197 sexual assaults. I'm not telling you this so you can feel sorry for me, but I want you to know the full spectrum of the trauma the survivors experience. 197 sexual assaults in less than 6 months. On July 27, 2004, 7 months after I went missing, the police found me, one girl from China, and a girl from Colombia. After being taken out of my trafficking situation, I was placed in the foster care system in the state of California and received federal and state-funded services. Good-intentioned people did whatever they could to help me. Unfortunately, they did not know what to do with me, an immigrant child who did not speak any English and did not have any family in the US and had experienced levels of trauma that the system has yet was capable to support. I received many services, some very well-intentioned, some were difficult. Some took my autonomy, some didn't ask what I needed. And some didn't realize the full extent of the trauma I had experienced. In 2004, just 4 years after the passing of the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, I was the first underage boy in the state of California to experience a severe form of human trafficking and sexual exploitation. This meant that the system was learning from me and my experience. And at that moment, I realized the power of survivors' voice in setting up the systems. While in services, I received medical, dental, vision, housing, case management, reunification, psychosocial services, immigration status, and a pathway to citizenship in the United States. Participating states, honorable colleagues, state-funded services hold the key for survivors to seek justice, recover, reintegrate to society, and prevent future victimization. The key to a full and healthy recovery and reintegration is a holistic assistance provided immediately after the trafficking experience and throughout the years. Cooperation between the case managers, survivors of trafficking, protective agency, governments, and lawyers, judges, all of those should work in synergy with the survivor of trafficking and to provide the essential services like preventing re-traumatization of the survivor during the criminal justice process, the healing of the physical and the psychological sequel of trauma, and preventing the school dropout, unemployment, homelessness, and facilitating academic success. Holistic assistance needs to be available, accessible, appropriate to every survivor of exploitation and slavery and human trafficking in this region. Professionals involved in the delivery of assistance need to work in coordination and in full synergy with the survivor of trafficking, not only among themselves, but also with the survivor of trafficking to have full control and power over their services. We need to ensure the survivors included at every step of the decision-making process while hearing their voices and respecting their agencies. This approach has the potential of empowering every survivor to be the agent of their own recovery, to convey this agency to other survivors, thus building up a bottom-up recovery model. In many regions of the world, including Europe, many people who experience sexual exploitation, human trafficking, or slavery still lack access to the tailor-made programs of recovery and reintegration. Whatever assistance is being made available to survivors of trafficking is fragmented and is still being provided by different agencies, institutions, organizations, which often do not coordinate care. I would like to stress the conflict and war creates the conditions to put children, people, especially children and sons of war and conflict at higher risk of exploitation, slavery, and human trafficking. Children across war-torn countries like Syria, Yemen, Palestine, Ukraine, Afghanistan, Iraq, Democratic Republic of Congo, Libya, Nigeria, South Sudan, and many other countries are currently experiencing high levels of trauma, anxiety, depression, death, and many other adverse childhood experience that will put children undeniably at higher risk of human trafficking and slavery. Participating states and honorable colleagues, consider adopting and fully implementing the optional protocols of the Convention of the Rights of the Children on the sale of children, child prostitution, and child pornography. As underlined in Article 8 and 9 of the protocol, state parties are required to adopt measures to protect the rights and interests of child victims and of the practices prohibited under the protocols. While these protocols are optional, our commitment to children cannot be optional. Our commitment to peace cannot be optional. If I may take off my hat as a professional and put on my hat as a survivor, participating states, honorable colleagues, if we are serious about human trafficking, we must be serious about peace. Peace is what brings recovery, peace is what brings people together, and peace is what brings internal recovery to people, especially those who have experienced civil rights violations. As a male survivor of human trafficking, I ask for the intentional and strategic engagement of male identifying victims and survivors of trafficking. We are often overlooked and often are seen as the perpetrator. I invite you to see us as people whose circumstances have put us in suffering and deserve to seek justice, heal, and recover. I ask you to believe us, believe male survivors of human trafficking and slavery. As survivors of human trafficking and as a person with disabilities, I ask you to see me as a whole person with hopes, aspirations, and goals. I ask member states to create mechanisms to reach people with visual, hearing, and tactile disability and ability needs. Create reporting mechanisms for people who speak or communicate or sign or use different forms of communication, because we must first ensure equity before we can all enjoy equality. Participating states and honorable colleagues, you have the unique ability to advocate and elevate the voices of survivors and of exploitation and human trafficking around the world. I ask you, continue to elevate the needs of survivors and voices of those with people with different disabilities and abilities, visual and hearing needs, speaking their unique languages, and sharing their unique perspective. Today, you heard from a person with mobile disabilities. I ask that tomorrow you listen to a person with visual needs and speaking their unique language. Participating states, as a then foreign national victim of trafficking without immigration status in the United States, I am now honored to have achieved US citizenship thanks to good humanitarian policy that allowed me to become a US citizen. Participating states, I ask for strong humanitarian policies and strong immigration regulations that offer a path to citizenship for survivors of slavery, human trafficking, and other human rights violations. Human trafficking doesn't happen in a vacuum. We must work collaboratively, offer education, unlearn outdated practices, and embrace survivor empowering messages. Participating states, honorable colleagues, children across the world at this very moment are being hurt, harmed, forced, exploited, marked, stolen, moved, displaced, persecuted, married, bombed, murdered, and often forgotten. We cannot afford another generation of children of trauma, born into trauma, suffering trauma, and live a life of trauma. We must protect children at this moment of suffering. We must uphold the rights of children and offer them peace, recovery, and justice. Thank you.
Herr Piraino-Guzman, vielen Dank für Ihre Ausführungen und für Ihre sehr bewegende eigene Geschichte. Ich glaube, es ist sehr deutlich geworden, dass Hilfeleistungen von den Erfahrungen der Überlebenden ausgehen müssen, damit sie wirklich zielgerichtet wirken und einen ganzheitlichen Ansatz wirklich zum Leben erwecken. Und auch danke für Ihre spezifischen Ausführungen zu der Situation von Jungen als Opfern. Ich eröffne nun die Diskussion für Erklärungen, Wortmeldungen und Kommentare der Delegationen. Und ich möchte Sie darum bitten, Ihre Intervention auf 2 Minuten zu beschränken, damit möglichst viele Teilnehmer dann zu Wort kommen können. Der erste Sprecher, die erste Sprecherin auf meiner Liste ist Frankreich im Namen der Europäischen Union, gefolgt von Bulgarien über Zoom. Frankreich, liebe Botschafterin, liebe Christine, Sie haben das Wort.
Merci, Madame la Présidente, chère Gesa. Avec votre permission, je passe la parole à la délégation de l'Union européenne.
Thank you. The EU thanks all speakers for their insights and for very moving remarks and for outlining measures to ensure a victim-centered and human rights-based approach in the fight against trafficking. We agree that effective protection is best achieved with a multi-stakeholder approach and effective partnerships. Moving forward, the EU strategy aims to improve protection for victims through actions to improve victim support and referral in the cross-border context towards setting up a European referral cooperation mechanism with the support of relevant EU agencies. To address trafficking at national, regional, and transnational levels, cooperation between relevant national and local authorities will be encouraged. The EU is also funding programs for victims in their recovery and reintegration, for example, through health, psychological, or legal services, and facilitating access to education and economic opportunities. The EU has also provided new funding for projects aimed at early identification of victims, especially in the course of asylum procedures, and at facilitating integration, assistance, and support of victims, taking into account the special needs. Efficiently targeting trafficking requires close cooperation between all participating states, partners for cooperation, and civil society. The EU continues to highly value the alliance as an informal platform for coordinating those efforts. We are pleased that the format of this conference allows wide participation, not only of states, but also of major international organizations, civil society, media, private sector, academia, and networks of national anti-trafficking practitioners. We very much value the discussions over the last 3 days on the importance of adequate protection for all victims and how to strengthen our efforts. The discussions have also touched upon existing protection and assistance systems, as well as on which vulnerabilities need to be addressed to ensure inclusive and effective protection, and which gaps remain in state identification and assistance mechanisms. As the war in Ukraine rages on, we must all commit to keep prevention measures in place and to be prepared to assist those displaced and in vulnerable situations. The EU is committed to mitigate the risk of human trafficking caused by this war. We repeat, the European Union and its member states stand by those in need of protection. We thank the Special Representative and Coordinator for combating THB for this conference, and we look forward to continuing addressing issues related to THB, as combating this heinous crime remains a priority for the EU. Thank you. Vielen Dank. Und ich übergebe das Wort an Bulgarien. Der Vertreter Bulgariens ist uns via Zoom zugeschaltet.
Your Excellency, dear panelists, the present government of the Republic of Bulgaria prioritizes zero tolerance for corruption and injustice. Thank you to Mr. Piraino-Guzman for the emotional speech filled with substance that reminded us that we need to be honest about vulnerabilities if we really want to bring significant results. Unfortunately, in Bulgaria, we have witnessed that no vulnerable groups have had the proper support and security system in the last 10 years. The current government, however, has a clear long-term vision, ambition, and political will to address these challenges immediately. Building capacity and trust in the institutions will be the first step in this direction. Developing adequate and modern policies and mechanisms to combat human trafficking is among our priorities. This is evident by the appointment of a Deputy Prime Minister for Effective Governance as Chair of the National Commission for Combating Inhuman Beings. The Commission determines and administers the implementation of the national policy and strategies of combating trafficking in human beings, as well as coordinates the interaction between separate institutions and organizations executing the Combating Trafficking in Human Beings Act to prevent trafficking and to protect, assist, and reintegrate victims of trafficking. Still, Bulgaria is facing severe challenges in combating trafficking in human beings as one of the primary source countries of human trafficking in the EU. We do not have enough services for the support to support victims of trafficking in human beings. Currently, only 7 services are functioning in the country under the Commission for Consultation, Temporary Accommodation and Reintegration. Additionally, there are 17 centers for children and 6 for adults operating the social assistance law. In 2021, 42 victims were accommodated in the shelters and received consulting services under the Act. 468 persons were formally identified as victims of human trafficking. 367 of them were women. In total, 282 are victims of trafficking for the purpose of sexual exploitation, and 105 are victims of forced labor. And I'm here now to tell you that we now know that the Bulgarian state has done so far is not enough, and that we commit more both for the victims and for all the people who are working in the system. We are ready to invest resources. We already work harder with the partners from the NGO sectors and the international community. So far, the civil society sector has been a key partner to raise the public awareness of human trafficking and to deliver the so much needed services and expertise in the field of protection, prevention, capacity building, and data collection related to human trafficking. In all local anti-trafficking of human beings commissions, there is a representative of the non-governmental sector. I also want to relate and update you about the situation with the Ukrainians fleeing the war. As we all know that the risk of human trafficking increases with the massive movement of populations, including unaccompanied minors. This situation requires immediate measures and strict coordination with all EU countries and international agencies and organizations. We as a government see this crisis as an opportunity to act fast and decisively on combating trafficking in human beings and resolving the deficits in the current systems. Up to today, 189,000 Ukrainians, mainly women with children, have crossed the Bulgarian border since the beginning of the war. More than 67,000 of them are in Bulgaria now, 1/3 of which are children. The government has established an operational unit with 6 working groups, collaborating with international humanitarian organizations, UN agencies, and the civil society sector, including a separate joint working group precisely on the issue related to combating trafficking in human beings. Considering the risk factors, we have created an accommodation program as a public-private partnership with large hotels, where more than 30,000 of the Ukrainians fleeing the war are safely accommodated under strict controls. Since the very first day of the conflict, we have created an integrated governmental informational portal in 4 languages, serving those in need. As we know that traffickers often seek to exploit the chaos of large-scale population movements, the Bulgarian government has taken measures to inform Ukrainians fleeing the war about their rights and safety via the informational portal, as well as coordinating targeted measures with the Ministry of Internal Affairs and Border Controls, as well as the NGO sector. Also, a call center that provides information and assistance in 3 languages is available. The National Commission for Combating Trafficking in Human Beings and the UNHCR Bulgaria have organized trainings for volunteers supporting the different aspects of assistance activities for victims of trafficking on a national level. I, as a chair of the Commission and as a member of the Bulgarian government, commit that from now on Bulgaria will do much more in combating trafficking in human beings. And I look forward to further cooperation with the Alliance Against Trafficking in Persons Protection and the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. The truth is that no one country's effort can be enough in a vacuum, and we need to act fast as a European family to work together with a decisive approach. Thank you so much for your attention.
Und ich danke Ihnen für Ihre Ausführungen. Die nächsten Sprecher auf meiner Liste sind die Delegation von Kanada über Zoom und der Vertreter des Heiligen Stuhles hier im Saal. Bitte, Kanada, Sie haben das Wort.
Merci beaucoup. Excellent. Chers collègues, nous remercions les panélistes pour leur réflexion pertinente. Reconnaissant que la traite de personnes est un crime hautement genré, les Canada préconisent la mise en place des systèmes de protection qui sont axés sur les victimes, reconnaissent la différence entre les genres, qui tiennent compte des traumatismes et qui sont fondés sur les droits de la personne. Le gouvernement du Canada reste également déterminé à s'attaquer à la violence systémique qui est à l'origine du taux disproportionné de victimisation chez les femmes et les filles autochtones au Canada. À cette fin, et en ce qui concerne l'amélioration de la capacité des systèmes d'identification et d'assistance dirigés par l'État à absorber et à répondre aux besoins de toutes les victimes, Le gouvernement du Canada continue de fournir un financement permanent à une ligne d'assistance nationale qui relie les victimes et les survivants et survivantes à des soins. Ceux-ci sont axés sur les besoins des victimes, prennent en compte leur traumatisme, sont disponibles 24 heures sur 24, 7 jours sur 7, 365 jours par an, sont offerts dans plus de 200 langues et sont accessibles aux personnes sourdes, malentendantes et non-verbales. Chair, recognizing trafficked persons as victims of crime rather than as criminals is an important first step. Moreover, we recommend that all participating states adopt and implement an analytical process that provides a rigorous method for the assessment of systemic inequalities, and one that allows for the assessment of how diverse groups of women, men, and gender diverse people may experience the policies, programs, and initiatives of their respective governments. Based on these findings, we recommend that all participating states adapt their protection responses to reflect these diverse needs and realities. Doing so promotes victims' healing and resiliency, allows victims to feel heard and to participate in a meaningful way, helps build trust, and increases the likelihood of victims' and survivors' participation in investigations, reduces the potential for further harm, re-victimization, and re-traumatization, and increases a more consistent standard of victim response. Canada will continue to engage with international community and civil society organizations to combat the trafficking of human beings and to provide dedicated support and protection to victims and survivors of this crime. Thank you very much.
Und ich danke Ihnen und übergebe das Wort an den Vertreter des Heiligen Stuhls, Monsignore, lieber Janusz. Sie haben das Wort.
Thank you very much. Madam Moderator, the delegation of the Holy See joins the others in expressing its gratitude to the panelists for their valuable presentations. The significant increase in migratory flows of people searching for peace and a secure future, including those displaced by the ongoing war in Ukraine, indicates the urgent need to establish durable solutions and security mechanisms, specifically to assist victims, protect vulnerable migrants from the risk of trafficking, and to prevent exploitation. In this respect, cooperation between state agencies, civil society, private sectors, and survivors groups, as well as to the work of the OSCE, has been fruitful in generating positive outcomes and restoring hope, especially to those in the most vulnerable situations. Nonetheless, states must redouble efforts to identify and develop new forms of protection, assistance, and partnerships. In this regard, we must acknowledge the work of civil society, including faith-based organizations and NGOs, which are able to reach isolated and marginalized communities that larger institutions and even governments cannot reach as easily. These institutions play an essential role in preventing the trafficking of human beings and in the assistance and reintegration of survivors. Therefore, increased collaboration and partnerships with these organizations by governments and other institutional actors can lead to innovative initiatives and contribute to best practices. The 22nd Conference of the Alliance Against Trafficking in Human Beings has once again served as an opportunity to unite efforts and to address this horrible phenomenon. Therefore, let us build on the deliberations and experiences shared over the past few days and act with renewed determination, effectiveness, and courage. As Pope Francis expressed, when speaking about building an economy without human trafficking, and I quote, "It is the courage of patient construction, of planning that does not look always and only at the very short-term gain, but at medium and long-term results, and above all, at people." In times of great crisis, this courage is even more necessary. Thank you, Madam Moderator.
Vielen Dank. Und die nächsten zwei Sprecher auf meiner Liste ist Frankreich in nationaler Kapazität und das Vereinigte Königreich. Frau Botschafterin, liebe Christine, Sie haben das Wort.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. Cher Gesa. Monsieur le représentant spécial, Excellences, Mesdames et Messieurs. La France s'associe pleinement à la déclaration prononcée au nom de l'Union européenne et je souhaiterais ajouter quelques mots à titre national. Je tiens à féliciter le représentant spécial de l'OSCE pour la lutte contre la traite des êtres humains, M. Val-Henricher, pour avoir organisé avec succès cette 22e conférence de l'Alliance sur la lutte contre la traite des personnes dans le contexte de l'agression de l'Ukraine par la Russie avec la complicité de la Biélorussie. La France est pleinement engagée dans la lutte contre la traite des êtres humains au niveau international et régional, en particulier ici à Vienne. La vocation de cette conférence est de tirer pleinement parti des bonnes pratiques actuelles afin d'accompagner les États dans leur lutte contre la traite des êtres humains. Mon pays vous a accueilli pour une visite officielle au printemps dernier, Monsieur le représentant spécial, et vous savez l'attachement de la France à l'approche globale des 4 P pour lutter contre la traite des êtres humains. Prévenir la traite, protéger et aider les victimes, poursuivre leurs auteurs et renforcer les partenariats. Cette année, la conférence de l'Alliance est dévolue à la protection des victimes de la traite en mettant l'accent sur le respect de leurs droits et le renforcement de l'assistance qui leur est portée. Je tiens à remercier l'ensemble des panélistes de haut niveau pour nous avoir permis de faire progresser notre compréhension des défis de la crise des réfugiés engendrée par la guerre lancée par la Russie contre l'Ukraine. Dans ce contexte, l'identification et la protection des victimes et potentielles victimes de traite est un enjeu primordial et urgent. Cette tragédie a déjà provoqué le déplacement massif de millions de personnes fuyant les atrocités des attaques indiscriminées lancées par la Russie, dans leur très grande majorité des femmes et des enfants, parfois sans l'encadrement nécessaire adapté à leurs besoins spécifiques. Les chiffres sont abyssaux. L'Union européenne vient d'adopter un plan en 10 points qui vise à assurer une plus grande coordination européenne pour l'accueil des personnes fuyant la guerre en Ukraine. Parmi les mesures les plus importantes figure notamment la création d'une plateforme européenne de solidarité pour échanger des informations sur les bénéficiaires de la protection temporaire et les statuts de protection nationaux, de même que le recensement des capacités d'accueil et d'hébergement pour faire correspondre les offres des États membres qui peuvent fournir une aide à ceux qui en ont besoin, et également la mise en œuvre en place de formation des agents chargés d'identifier les victimes de traite particulièrement. La France participe pleinement à cette coordination et reste mobilisée dans le cadre de l'OSCE pour lutter efficacement contre la traite, en particulier en lien avec cette guerre. Et nous sommes prêts à renforcer notre appui aux actions de l'OSCE dans ce contexte, notamment en Moldavie. En cette période qui est l'une des plus sombres que nous ayons connues depuis la naissance de cette organisation, nous exhortons la Russie à mettre fin à cette guerre et à assumer sans délai et sans condition aucune ses responsabilités, en garantissant pleinement la protection des populations civiles sous le joug de son armée et en respectant pleinement le droit international humanitaire. Il en va de la préservation des valeurs les plus fondamentales sur lesquelles repose l'humanité. Je vous remercie, Madame la Présidente.
Vielen Dank und ich übergebe das Wort jetzt an das Vereinigte Königreich. Herr Botschafter Libanil, bitte, Sie haben das Wort.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. Thank you, Gesa. And thank you to all the speakers in the final panel, as well as to you, Val, and your office for everything in the conference. The UK continues to value the OSCE's role in combating trafficking in human beings as a convener, a thought leader, and as a delivery partner, all of which have been demonstrated over these last 3 days. We were pleased to be able to support the Office of the Special Representative during the financial year just ended with the second phase of their project on supply chains, an area where many victims of trafficking are hidden. And we stand ready to support the Office in their response to the war in Ukraine. As we sit here, and as others have said before me, Russia continues its war of aggression, violating the borders of another country and causing widespread suffering. Among the many terrible tragedies resulting from this conflict are the massive displacements and refugee flows that are creating conditions that, as UNICEF has said, could lead to a significant spike in human trafficking and an acute child protection crisis. 2 million children have now fled Ukraine, and an additional 2.5 million children have been displaced. And as the barbarism of Russia's actions is being laid bare, there is also the risk that criminals exploit this appalling humanitarian situation. As we've heard earlier this week, human rights organizations are starting to register the first cases of suspected sex traffickers and pimps preying on Ukrainian women near refugee shelter points. They report women as having been accosted under the guise of offers of transport, work, or accommodation. As more people start to flee individually rather than in groups, individuals who need protection are sadly even more vulnerable to abuse. I commend the work of the OSCE in documenting the testimony of those who have fled President Putin's war of aggression in Ukraine. As our Minister for the United Nations said recently at the UN General Assembly, we must all listen carefully to the most vulnerable in our societies and come together regionally and internationally to ensure that this generation of trafficking victims is the last. Thank you very much, Madam Moderator, and thank you again, Val, for the conference.
Vielen Dank. Und die beiden letzten Sprecher auf meiner Liste ist der Vertreter der Türkei, gefolgt von Malta via Zoom. Bitte, Türkei, Sie haben das Wort.
Thank you, Madam Ambassador. We would like to thank the Office of the Special Representative and Coordinator for Combating Trafficking in Human Beings for organizing this fruitful meeting, and also thank the panelists for their comprehensive presentations. Turkey has been taking effective measures to fight against human trafficking. We will convey the key points and best practices which were expressed during this conference to our capital with a view to exploring the methods to further our efforts in this field. We can fight against human trafficking only through international cooperation. With this understanding, we fully support all the international cooperation mechanisms in combating human trafficking. We have close collaboration with the Office of the Special Representative Coordinator for Combating THP of the OSCE, as well as with the Group of Experts on Action Against Trafficking in Human Beings, GRETA, within the Council of Europe. Turkey, in cooperation with the IOM, has put into service the 157 helpline for victims of trafficking in persons. Helpline is currently available in 7 languages. We have introduced numerous administrative and legal measures regarding the main pillars of combating human trafficking: prevention, protection, prosecution, and cooperation. In December 2019, human trafficking was included in the Catholique crimes of the Criminal Procedural Code of Turkey. This has considerably strengthened the judicial processes. In order to coordinate the efforts on fight against human trafficking, we have established a coordination body among relevant public institutions. Approximately 20,000 public officials, including judges, prosecutors, law enforcement personnel, experts, academics, as well as students and volunteers, were trained in 2021 for effective fight against human trafficking. Last year, our experts interviewed with almost 8,000 potential victims of human trafficking. It was 60% increase compared to 2020. We have established a desk system in each city so as to immediately assess cases of trafficking in persons. Victims and possible victims are directed to to these desks. Madam Ambassador, unfortunately nowadays the risk of human trafficking is high on the international agenda once more due to the current situation in Ukraine. We regret that according to the UNHCR data, more than 4 million Ukrainians have passed through the neighboring countries since 24th of February. The plight of Ukrainian women and children is a source of particular concern. Over 56,000 Ukrainians have been admitted to our country with facilitated procedures. In order to put an end to the humanitarian tragedy, we have been continuing our efforts to bring Russian and Ukrainian authorities together to reach a ceasefire and a diplomatic settlement. Thank you.
Und ich danke Ihnen und ich übergebe das Wort an Malta, die uns über Zoom zugeschaltet sind. Malta, bitte, Sie haben das Wort.
Guten Tag, Madam Ambassador, Special Representative, distinguished speakers and participants. My name is Lynn Kirkhoff-Faure, a lawyer by profession, and today I am representing the Maltese Human Rights Directorate. While we concur with the statement delivered by the EU delegation, I would like to present some points under my national capacity. In the course of fulfilling its obligations, Malta is working on a more centralized and efficient national referral mechanism to bring together under one focal point the action plans of the individual national entities responsible to combat the crime of trafficking in human beings. Malta has established a national collaborative mechanism for the gathering of evidence for prosecution purposes, since it is a known fact that criminals are well versed in the limitations of the law. They manage to find the legal loopholes in the criminal justice system, and the growing challenges through online recruitment and other means that contribute to modern slavery manage to undermine the investigations led by the national authorities. To this effect, Malta has established an interministerial mechanism tasked with revising and making trafficking indicators actionable, while fostering coordination, of course, among all the stakeholders. Collectively, we must empower both international and national legal and natural persons to acquire legal standing during national criminal proceedings and to act as interveners and collaborate with the law enforcement institutions. This, I believe, will enable potential victims of THB to be represented by the national entities, both law enforcement and the social welfare services or civil organizations, while they remain unknown to the perpetrators and avoid having to suffer further victimization. For this reason, we continue to seek transnational cooperation to find the solutions required by our national institutions and provide them with the necessary assistance for investigation purposes and to overcome any jurisdictional limitations of the national justice systems. I thank you once again for this opportunity and the close collaboration which we have with OSCE. Thank you for supporting the Maltese Islands.
Und ich danke Ihnen. Meine Rednerliste hier ist hiermit erschöpft. Ich frage noch einmal alle Teilnehmer hier im Saal, ob es weitere Wortmeldungen gibt. Das scheint nicht der Fall zu sein. Dann möchte ich jetzt unseren Rednern die Gelegenheit geben, auf Fragen und Bemerkungen der Delegationen zu antworten und einzugehen. Und ich werde die Redner dazu in der umgekehrten Reihenfolge aufrufen. Und als erstem erteile ich damit Herrn Piraino-Guzman das Wort. Bevor ich das tue, möchte ich nochmal ausdrücklich unseren Dolmetschern danken, die jetzt eigentlich eine Pause gehabt hätten, aber uns mitgeteilt haben, dass sie bereit sind, noch über die vereinbarte Zeit hinaus uns zur Verfügung zu stehen. Ganz herzlichen Dank an Sie. Das war ein langer Tag für alle. Und hiermit übergebe ich Herrn Piraino-Guzman das Wort. Bitte.
Thank you, Madam Chair. It's an honor again to be with you all and to share one three more comments and to close my statements today. First will be a quote from Martin Luther King, who has become the verse of my motto in my life. Commit yourself to the noble struggle for equal rights. You will make a better person of yourself, a greater country of your country, and a finer world to live in. Now, with this, I also invite you to know and do not reinvent the wheel. OSCE ODIHR has the International Survivor of Trafficking Advisory Council. We are people with extraordinary backgrounds, experiences, and expertise. Please come to us, ask questions. Tatiana with the OSCE and ODIHR is one of our contact. We invite you to please continue to come to us and ask survivors for their input, ask us critical questions, and learn from our experience. Lastly, as a psychologist, as a case manager, I always seek to work myself out of the job. And I don't mean quitting my job. I mean that every effort that I do to support people must be sustainable. I invite you to work yourself out of the job. Do not quit your job. I'm asking you to please make sure that the efforts are sustainable and they are far-reaching and that we'll be able to offer justice and recovery to survivors of human trafficking. Thank you.
Und ich danke Ihnen und würde als nächsten Madame Kollas das Wort ergeben. Danke.
Merci beaucoup, Madame la Présidente. Moi, je voudrais insister sur un point, c'est la question des enfants. On a vraiment un gros travail à faire de ce côté-là. Il faut vraiment que nous collaborions ensemble au niveau international et entre institutions et associations pour combattre ce fléau et aujourd'hui mieux enregistrer les enfants, mieux les accompagner et mieux leur permettre d'avoir une vraie vie d'enfant et de grandir dans la sérénité.
Ich danke Ihnen und übergebe das Wort an Herrn Bierwirth, bitte.
Yeah, thank you very much. Also to all the delegations for the feedback given and the commitments made as to the protection of refugees, including those fleeing the conflict in Ukraine. Three short points. First, in reaction to the comments from the Holy See. Absolutely right. You need to engage a broad spectrum of civil society partners, including faith-based organizations, but also diaspora and minority-based organization to have the maximum reach out. And in particular, diaspora organizations can play a very helpful role in receiving Ukrainians. The key is also as protection against falling victim of trafficking. Leave no one alone. Leave no one alone. Everyone should have someone to contact, be it family, being NGO, be it friends, people they travel together. Leave no one alone, because the more isolated the displaced person is, the higher the risk. Second, all other rules to prevent falling victim of trafficking, access to decent work, legal work, access to education. We have not spoken much of it because it was not so specific, but that all applies. And I can just thank the many OSCE participating states for really moving quickly in bringing children into school systems and allowing legal work. And my last comment is a feedback to Geneviève. The issue you raised on the children born to surrogate mothers, I think it deserves its own conference because it has so many questions, generally and specifically now in such a displacement crisis. The key message should be, don't find solutions on the back or to the detriment of the children born who have nothing to do with the choices made by their physical and other mothers and fathers. It's very complex and maybe well for follow-up topic. Thank you.
Vielen Dank. Und ich übergebe jetzt das Wort an Frau Staatssekretärin Nestorovska. Bitte.
Very shortly comment from me. I would like to stress again that I'm convinced that we are on a right direction, especially when we discuss, especially when we analyze cooperation between national commission in the region and broader. And I think that we will continue to share our experience, our learned lessons, and try to be more effective, because we have only one goal: to stop trafficking of human beings and to help the victims. Thank you.
Und ich danke Ihnen. Congressman Smith konnte leider nicht weiter uns folgen wegen anderer Verpflichtungen. Damit danke ich Ihnen allen sehr für Ihre hervorragenden Beiträge zu dieser Sitzung, sowohl unseren Panelisten, aber auch allen Delegationen und Teilnehmern, die beigetragen haben. Wir haben die 30-minütige Kaffeepause gestrichen und werden jetzt daher sofort mit der Schlusssitzung fortfahren, und ich übergebe an Bräutigam. Bitte.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, and thank you so much for moderating the panel, the closing panel, and thanks to all the great speakers for that that fantastic discussion. Really very interesting and comprehensive. Let me also just take a moment to thank the interpreters for plowing ahead, and I'll be brief because there's no way I can summarize the 3 days anyway, but I will make a few quick points and then we will let everybody have a coffee and a snack. Ladies and gentlemen, we're about to close now the 22nd conference of the Alliance Against Trafficking in Persons, and it's been a fascinating 3-day discussion, and I think a very timely one. So let me first extend a heartfelt thanks to everyone who contributed. I was delighted to see over these days so many participants in the room after a couple of very challenging years. And so many of our old friends who we haven't seen in a while or we only saw online were here in person. And then we've made a lot of new friends over these days. It's fantastic. Over 850 people registered for this conference, including 90 representatives of international organizations and over 200 civil society members. I also want to thank everyone who contributed to the great conversation. In particular, and I want to start with the survivor leaders who shared their expertise, their experience, and their personal reflections. They have, as you saw from Jennifer Richardson, who spoke at the beginning of this conference, to Suamhirs Piraino-Guzman, who closed it, you have seen the power and just the tremendous passion that they bring to these conversations. I also want to thank the government officials who came to share their country's efforts and to learn more, international and non-governmental organizations who helped us understand what is being done on the ground and what more needs to be done. The wide range of participants and speakers in this conference alone is a great testament, I think, to the value of this organization and the value it can bring to the anti-trafficking conversation. Let me also take a moment to thank the ICT team, which connected us to all 57 corners of the OSCE region, as well as the interpreters and conference services team for their hard work and dedication. Allow me also to take a moment to thank my own incredible team from the Office of the Special Representative. It was, as always, a tremendous group effort with everyone contributing over several days, but also on weeks and months leading up to this event. Let me just take one moment to recognize Sasha Kirilenko, who was the lead on this year's conference and benefited from huge support from Jayron Shafiyeva on logistics and Lilia Rotoloni on communications. Everyone contributed, but I think I have to recognize them. I also want to take a moment to recognize Carly Church, a survivor leader who counseled us on our concept of the conference from its early inception to the development of the conference, to planning, executing, and organizing her own side event as part of this. I think it's really important to acknowledge that that leadership that she has shown as a survivor leader to actually execute pieces of this project. We're very grateful for her contribution. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, the Polish chairmanship began this year with one of its priorities being to help the most vulnerable in society. I can hardly think of a more appropriate priority to guide this conference than that. And I think we've heard over the last few days just how timely and important this conversation is. So as we now depart from the conference, I want to share a few of the primary lessons that I've taken away and that I hope we can all carry with us in our work. First, we are not doing a good enough job at identifying and protecting victims of trafficking. In fact, a bit dismal when you consider that less than 1% of all trafficking victims is ever identified, and too few of those who are identified actually receive the services and support they need. Adequately protecting victims of trafficking remains a major gap in our collective anti-trafficking response. Second, the good news. There are plenty of positive examples states can deploy to dramatically improve their record on this. I'll quote Magdalena here. Steal from each other a little bit. There's some good practices out there. Borrow them and use them. For example, the number one thing we heard over these days is the need to separate assistance to victims from their cooperation with the criminal justice system. This is a major obstacle to effective identification and protection. Because of the nature of trafficking and because of victims' understanding, victims' vulnerabilities, and often fear of law enforcement, victims are very unlikely to self-identify. This is why we need to establish anti-trafficking frameworks that put victims in protection first. First, we assist the victims, we keep them safe, and we make sure they have access to services they need, and then and only then can we start thinking about criminal justice and their role in it. I encourage countries to see prosecution and protection as two sides of the same coin. Protection is an obligation related to the rights of victims, but it's also an effective law enforcement strategy. Likewise, prosecution is not only about enforcing the law, but also an important avenue for the protection of victims' rights. Supported victims lead to stronger cases, and so protection has to come first. Third major lesson learned is how we can practically implement the principle of identification that I just mentioned. We need to establish agreed principles, and then we need to implement them. There are systems that can help you build trust with victims. One, in what we call the social path in the OSCE to obtain victim status. The social path means that agencies outside law enforcement can actually grant the formal status of victim of trafficking. That is necessary in order to obtain assistance and services. This approach has the benefit of building positive assistance-based relationships with victims, including through establishing state-led national referral mechanisms. I strongly encourage states to look into these systems and approaches as they can help you implement practically the human rights-based approach we've been talking about. Fourth, we overlook and underserve too many victims, most often those who do not conform with what we see as the ideal victim. National, ethnic, and linguistic minorities, refugees and migrants, persons with disabilities, and on and on. To borrow the title of one of the side events we had at this conference, how many victims hidden in plain sight do we miss? The answer is far too many. We heard how gender plays a crucial role in the trafficking process, from toxic societal norms and vulnerabilities to reinforcing biases and misconceptions that still largely prevent us from, for example, recognizing men and boys who are sexually exploited. I want to encourage countries to adopt what we call a gender-sensitive approach. That is one that recognizes that different victims have different needs and builds protection systems able to address them adequately. Fifth, on children. Trafficking in children continues to be on the rise. In 2014, 13% of identified trafficking victims were children, and by 2018, that number had risen to 34%, with the COVID pandemic pushing for a further risk, as we heard from the UN SRSG on Monday. I just want to take a moment to reflect on this. We have been working on combating child trafficking for the last 20 years, and over the last 15 years, the rate of identified victims has tripled. We are not doing a good job. The fact that we have been putting in this much effort and the problem has only gotten worse is a sign that we need to reflect on the amount of resources we're putting into this and the strategies and tactics we're using. Child victims of trafficking are entitled to special protection measures, both as children and as victims. Safety, protection, and assistance are fundamental for the fulfillment and enjoyment of children's rights, and we must take vigorous measures against all forms of child exploitation offline and online. And we need to reinforce the role of state child protection agencies in national anti-trafficking responses, including through better cross-border cooperation and exchange of information between countries. I call on participating states again to begin establishing national focal points for trafficked children and use the terms of reference for this function that we developed over a year ago, which I think have become incredibly relevant to this moment in time when half of the people fleeing Ukraine are children. The sixth and last lesson is that there is no time to lose. These topics were urgent 2 months ago in Europe and outside. With the humanitarian crisis developing in relation to Ukraine, there is an urgent need to protect vulnerable people. My office has developed policy recommendations and we will help states to operationalize those recommendations and support states in strengthening their anti-trafficking frameworks to mitigate the risks of even more trafficking and exploitation in Europe. Let's borrow ideas from each other, let's share them, let's work together to implement. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I open this conference by saying that these 3 days would be about victims of trafficking and about the actions we must take to protect them, to uphold their rights, to assist them in recovering from the trauma and harm they have suffered, and to empower them to regain their agency and contribute to society with their talents and aspirations. Now we need to make lessons a reality. These lessons are reality on the ground. We owe it to the millions of victims of trafficking out there who desperately need protection. So I will end by borrowing 2 lines, one from Magdalena. Our responsibility is greater than their invisibility. And I will borrow from Suamhirs. Our commitment cannot be optional. Thank you so much for participating in the Alliance Conference.